Hello and welcome back for another very interesting lecture on Earth science. So this presentation in particular deals with deciphering Earth's history. Although a short presentation, there's a lot of additional material available to you throughout the modules online and other limitless resources. But I really wanted to introduce this topic in particular because it really segues into a course that most geology programs have, which is called historical geology. I think that that phrase, historical geology, can somewhat seem confusing, but the reality is it's about deciphering Earth's history, and it's really about learning about the fossil record. So we'll introduce a couple elements of that. We'll introduce relative versus absolute dating, and we'll talk about different examples of both. We'll talk about some fossils, very brief. Again, this is a very short presentation, but it's just enough to try to get you excited about this topic. So let's begin. So there are two families, if you will, of dating. There's relative and then there's absolute. So relative dating, we really give that that value or that idea to Dr. Nicholas Steno, who pretty much created the fundamentals or the laws of something that made sense, but it's like gravity. We knew gravity existed, but it just took someone to finally piece it together to make sure that everyone understood what it made sense to. So he came up with the idea of relative dating in the sense of looking at the different types of superposition that material can be. So I'm going to point at some of the diagrams on the screen. So what we know is that, as an example, this layer here and this layer here, since they are the same layer, they are the same age or the same size. That's looking at what we consider lateral continuity. Well, why is that important? Well, because when starting to piece the puzzle together of plate tectonics, this was very helpful because we would find material, as an example, after Gondwana land, we can see that there's material that is the same within the Appalachians in North America and on different continents. And that allowed us to see that those are both at the same level, although they were very, very far apart. So that's an example of that. Then we have the value of superposition. Well, what does that mean? That means what's on the bottom should be the oldest. So think about like stacking papers in that sense. If I'm grading papers and I start stacking papers, the one on the bottom I graded first, the one on the top is the most recent. And that is the law of superposition. That makes sense, right? Is there any chance or a time that that may not be the case? Well, sure, perhaps there's been some faulting, some folding, things flip, so that's when things do become a little more confusing, but just looking at the basics, we understand that looking at relative dating that we can put things in order. Now, the key with the phrase relative means that we don't have an absolute date. We don't know, well, he graded that paper exactly 13.4 minutes ago. You don't know, but you know the order, so you know that anything that was laid down in that layer should all be somewhat continuous across the screen, right? So, and then the last one is just looking at cross-cutting, is that sometimes we have things that within a sequence that give us this bigger picture. So this diagram I chose for the bottom, an example of cross-cutting could be this letter A, which is perhaps a fault or a fracture. It could be perhaps letters H or G, both of which are intrusions of, I think in this category, they're kind of giving the example of granite. This one would be considered like a pluton for H, and this would be more of a dike for letter G. So this idea of relative dating, again, it doesn't give us exact numbers, but it kind of allows us to put things in order without having to, have all that science behind it. That's why this was really the first piece of that. The first looking at geologic or deep time was looking at relative dating, because we put things in a relative sequence or order. So in this case here, we know that because of the law of lateral continuity and part of Steno's law, that they are laid down in horizontal layers. So layer F, although that's been offset here, when it was laid down, they would have been together. So the oldest material here should be F, then E, then letter D, then C, then B. And then after those layers were in place, then there must have been some form of tectonics involved or faulting that separated this cross-cutting or letter A and offset this area. Then H would have been next, then G, and then the most recent layer is going to be I, which is where this farm is. So again, it's F, E, D, C, B, A, H, G, and then I. So that kind of puts things in some form of order, at least. So this is relative dating. So again, relative is just putting things in relationship as to where they should be without having specific dates. Now, if we want to look at absolute dating, there's lots of different ways to do absolute dating. I'm by no means going through all of the very specific science involved in it, mostly because, again, this is an earth science course. It's introductory. It's just trying to get you excited about these topics. So I have some examples of relative dating that I like to mention. Are there others? Yes, there are, but then again, simplify, simplify, simplify. So the first one, which is actually one that I really think is kind of fun, is tree rings. It's called dendrochronology. So what we do is, well, we'll back up. When trees grow every year, they create a new line, a tree line of growth that grows around it. Now, I gave an example here. Now, what ends up happening is the thickness of the line can denote perhaps a sequence of excess precipitation, so it was a good year for growth, so it has a thicker line. Lines that are a lot thinner are usually drought years. We can also observe lines that may have burn marks in case there was a fire. So they're really, really helpful in that sense. So every year the tree grows a new ring. So what we do is we take this, it's a core, and we twirl it through a tree, pull the core out, and we can sit there and count every ring on that tree to know how old that tree is. Well, why is that important? Well, because we can see areas of drought or fire or excess precipitation and things like that, floods. We're able to then put in an exact date and go, well, this tree is exactly this old. Well, in some cases, trees are maybe only 50 to 100 years old. That's a pretty good run, and it gives you a lot of great history, climatic history for that time sequence. But what about things that are older? Well, there are some instances, especially in California, we have what's identified as the bristlecone pine. That is the world's oldest living tree, over 4,000 years old. So they've got a lot of these lines into very thin pieces, and they can sit there and count them, and they can go back. In fact, they have if you ever get to visit, they have a visitor center, and they have a large, it was a tree that had collapsed, and they cut the piece out so you can see all the rings, and they marked, this is where, the Roman Empire, began, where it ended, going all the way back to before the pyramids were built. So it's quite impressive to see a tree that has that many rings. So that gives us exact numbers. Another one that's great is ice cores. So we're able to go into Arctic regions, drill down, get an ice core. This is an example of an ice core. There are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 layers here. So this has been laid down. They get pulled up this way as a core. What's interesting about these ice cores is that as ice, water turns into snow, and then snow turns into ice, and it becomes compacted, it compresses and squishes down. But what it does in those sequences, it also traps in, if you see these little air bubbles, those air bubbles actually trap in what the atmosphere would have been like at that date. So we're able to kind of, very similar to tree rings in that sense, but we're able to then track down and go, okay, this depth represents an Earth at this time, and then they can use a small needle, pluck that oxygen out, and then look at what the atmospheric conditions would have been at that time. We also have radioactive decay of isotopes, which is the classic half-life thing. So here I gave an example of what that would look like. So here we have samples of years. So if you have 100% at year 1, it would drop down to 50. At year 2, it drops down to 25. In year 3, and so on. So we're able to then look at these isotopes and how many isotopes are there, and that allows us to give an exact date of when that rock would have formed. We also have radiometric dating. So there's there's always a blue. There we go, about 50,000 years. So we can do carbon-14 dating, which is this example here. Very similar, so carbon decays. This is only good for items that go as far back as 50,000 years, because at that point, then there's not a lot of carbon left or remaining. Things that you could use this for would be, leaves, vegetation, coal, things like that. We also have potassium to argon. This one's a lot more intense to do. So this is best for igneous rocks because, argon's not very common, and it's only found in igneous rocks for the most part. And they're able to watch that as potassium transfers into argon, which is a gas, they're able to calculate a lifespan. So they're able to look at a particular igneous rock, a piece of continental crust, and to be able to distinguish how old that rock was when it solidified. And the last one is going from uranium to lead. It's another type of radiometric dating in which we look over time, uranium will turn into lead. So when we look at things that are made out of lead, the chances are they had originally been in a form of uranium, and we're able to then calculate that. So this is how they actually measured the age of the Earth, is by looking at the uranium to lead levels, and so on and so forth. So these are all examples. The lecture book that you have online gives you very, very distinguished step-by-step process on how this is done. For myself in the field, I've used tree rings. I've also used carbon-14 dating. We did that with seashells. We were able to look within a distinct layer of sedimentary rock, and we found what we identified as being a death layer, meaning that there was nothing, sand, silt, all these layers, and all of a sudden, boom, all these seashells. And then we took all these little snails, and we sent them to Arizona State University, in which they did the carbon-14 dating on them, and they came back at about 3,000 years old. So we still, we're using this as just tree rings, nice. Well, tree rings in particular, that's the cheapest, and then you kind of work your way through cost. So the fossil record, well, how fossils form, there's lots of different ways. We can look at, well, what they are, and that being as fossils can be any remains or traces of an ancient organism. So that means it doesn't have to be just, in our mindset of dinosaurs. I mean, that's a great one to use as an example, but can other things be? And the answer is yes. There's lots of different processes in which things can be fossilized. There's different levels of fossilization, and lots of different things can be done. As you see, I use the word traces, meaning that tracks. We actually have fossiled footprints of different organisms, multicelled and complex organisms. In Dinosaur National Monument, there's dinosaur tracks out there, some in Utah. We also have lots, well, actually at most colleges we have some of the specimens there too, but it's pretty cool. But it can be anything. One of my favorites is this guy right here. This is a classic piece of, I know what you're thinking, and that's exactly what it is. This is called coprolite. Coprolite is fossilized dung. It's poop, in a sense. Why is this important? Well, at first it was more of a novelty item to collect because it's kind of neat. Obviously, it's very old. There's no scent. It's solid rock. It's materialized that sense. But what was important is that now we can use very, very, very thin cutting devices, either being diamond blades or lasers, and we can thin slice these type of fossils. And by doing so, we're able to learn first whatever animal this came from, what type of diet they had, because it actually can fossilize everything inside. So if they had a piece of corn, there would be a piece of fossilized corn in here. Gross, but neat. That's called coprolite. So anyway, fossilization, that's the most rare. You have to think complete. Why is that rare? Well, you need the appropriate environments, but the big one is that most animals, when they die, they were picked apart by scavengers. So it was very rare that it would just lay down and then everything was perfect. We find that fossilization in the fullest sense occurs in places like the liberated tar pits, where we find full animals still articulated, or certain environments like this one here, the Samoria, which is it's an amphibian they're complete. It's very rare, usually in the bottoms of water and stuff like that, where other animals or organisms are not able to rip or tear things apart. An example of that would be like a couple of years ago, we got called, a couple of friends of myself got called to excavate a mammoth leg. There was a leg and a tusk and like a part of a jaw. It was all over the place. It wasn't articulated because when he had died about 10,000 years ago on an ancient beach ridge, he was picked apart by something. So there was just bits and pieces left. But it was really neat to be able to be part of that. Permineralization, where bone or wood is exposed to mineral-rich waters. So in this case, in permineralization, we have petrified wood. So this is a photo of petrified wood, so we can see all of the different layers. All the layers within the wood itself would absorb, well, as the carbon would break down, it would be replaced by other minerals, and then it would actually just create a complete replica of what that once was. Preserved remains such as amber. This is really neat. This is actually, this is obviously a photo. We got some little insects in there, but this was a very exciting find. I took this photo, I think, from the Smithsonian. This is a dinosaur tail, and so they're going to be doing some additional research to see, because obviously We thought that most dinosaurs themselves were scale-like, but now we're starting to see stuff like this that's been preserved in amber that show that, yeah, maybe there were some scale-like cells, but maybe they actually had feathers and fur instead. And then lastly are living fossils. Well, what are living fossils? Well, those are things that we still have today that we've found in the fossil record, and we have noticed that there's been very little change. So perhaps think of some things that you think have been around for a long time, and Google it. I think you'd be quite surprised as to how many living fossils we have, not just as an animal that we can identify, but also plants. There's a lot of plants and ferns that have very little change in millions of years, and that's actually pretty interesting. Another element to the fossil record that we look at is when identifying different types of vegetation is that depending on leaf structure in particular, whether it would be more broad and rounded versus more pointy, that also is a indicator of climate. Depending on what type of climate it was experiencing and environments. And so again, these are just kind of some fun things. We also offer a class called Dinosaurs. Perhaps you should take that as well. It's a biological science. It's pretty neat, nonetheless. So a couple of things I wanted to show. Because who doesn't like a good show and tell? So this is a piece of shale, but on the shale, as you can see, I'll kind of tilt it just right, you've got a fossilized fish. What's neat about this is that it's actually an imprint. So when the fish had died, it had laid down like this, and then it was compacted. And when it did that, it pushed, well, simplistically, if I make it close enough, you might be able to see it. You can actually see the rib cage and all the different organs and items that would have been in there. So that's kind of neat. Another one, more local to us, because most of you live in Santa Clarita. Most of Santa Clarita was underneath the water, so actually I found this in Santa Clarita. It is a fossilized clamshell. So there's actually still, you can see the hinge in the back. You can see a part, just a little bit there of shell that remains. But this is everything that was inside the, piece fell off. Everything that was inside the clam itself is what's been replicated. So you have to think about it. What would this be? Is this complete fossilization on the inside, or is this going to be looking more at different elements? You know, what do we have here? Actually, most of what's in here is, it appears to be a sandstone, so it's really more of a cast in that sense. Very little organic material even remains in this case. So, nonetheless, show and tell, kind of interesting. So, how do we look at this? Well, this is early life on Earth. What's interesting about this is broken up into eons, and I'll talk about that in a moment. So we go back into about 4 billion years up into today, into the Quaternary, looking at the different types of organisms that have been on the planet. So in the Archean, we can see that we're looking at the first living organisms and bacteria, single cell. Then we move into the first algae. Then we move into some multi-celled organisms moving up into here, such as trilobites. Oh, trilobites, shoot. That is a, oh, let's see if I can hold it a little bit better. That is a trilobite. This is one of the first multi-celled organisms. As you can see, same, very similar image there that I'm pointing at. Multiple different series and variations of trilobites existed. So, in fact, what's interesting about trilobites is that this was one of the first fossils that was identified. There's one called the trilobite paradoxides, which what was interesting about it is that they found one on the east coast of the United States and then one all the way over in Europe. And they were of the exact same species, same style, same design. And they knew that at one point those areas must have been together. What's also neat about these is that when you get a really good fossilized trilobite, in fact, you can see there's some, oh, maybe not, there's some little elements on the bottom, this is the bottom versus the top, is that you're able to do thin slices and be able to see their intestinal tracts, their organs, how they worked on the inside. It's very, very cool. So they move into the Cambrian. That was what's identified as the Cambrian explosion of life. CO2 levels, carbon dioxide levels, were incredibly high, and things became very, very large. We move into the Carboniferous again, another time in which that's when, in the Carboniferous, things were huge. They had dragonflies that were 6 feet across. Leaves on vegetation were incredibly broad and waxy. And then we move into the Permian, the Triassic, the Jurassic. We move into the Cretaceous. and then we move into the Paleogene, and then we move into the Quaternary, which is where we are. As you can see, mammoths. We're just right about where humans were. If you're interested in mammoths, you should look up the pygmy mammoths of Channel Islands. There's some great research being done there on pygmy mammoths. There were two types. There was like a North America and a South America version, and then there were these pygmy ones that were about 5 foot 8 inches in height, so they would have been like ride-on mammoths in a sense, and they were found there. The reason that they got on that island to begin with, the Channel Islands at one point was a land bridge when sea level was very, very low because we were going through a glacial maxima. The Channel Islands was a mountain range. It's part of the Santa Monica Mountains, and the animals were able to get out that way. But what's always funny is that if you take a dinosaur class, the first thing they really take you through is that you're very familiar with Jurassic Park, and as you can see, most of the dinosaurs that we've seen in Jurassic Park are not even in the Jurassic period, but nonetheless. So I just thought this was a great way to look at the grander scale of things. Again, if this isn't exciting to you, I really suggest that you look into taking a historical geology course because we have pretty much one of every single piece of these, and then you're able to learn how to identify the process in which it went through, and it's pretty neat. What's also interesting when looking at algae during this period, some of the algae, actually there's one called, was part of a stromatolite system. Stromatolites is where our oxygen came from on our planet, so this algae in particular that develops stromatolites goes through photosynthesis, and as a byproduct it makes oxygen, and then it would precipitate. Its waste product was actually rock and look like big mushrooms. And what's interesting about that is that they still exist. There's an area in Shark Bay, Australia, where they have a stromatolite field. Why is this important? Well, because after observing and learning about these stromatolites and how they operate and the algae on that rock, then looking back into the fossil record in other areas around the world, they learn to see that there are fossilized stromatolites that take us back, not just millions, but now billions of years ago, and that we've had stromatolites pretty much everywhere that there was a shallow sea with warmer water. So pretty neat. So then we move into this. This is putting it together. This is a lot of information, and by no means am I expecting you to memorize all of this. But this is, with all the data that we have using absolute, relative, every type of dating, this is the geologic scale by the Geological Society of America. This is the most up-to-date that we have available. Now, why is this important? Well, you have an activity coming up in which you have a very simplistic geologic timescale, and you're missing some of the key components. This is a great diagram that you can pull those answers from to fill in for your activity. So as you can see, we have it broken up into a million of years. You have magnetic polarity, which takes us back a couple weeks, learning about magnetic polarity and how it changes and how we observed it specifically in basaltic material from divergent zones. We have the name of a period, the epoch, the age, and those are the big key pieces that we will identify. So we can see that like right now we're part of the Quaternary, but our epoch is going to be considered the Holocene. So that's more recent. So we kind of break it into those pieces. Again, right here, I know it's kind of hard to see, but there's the word Pleistocene. That was our last glacial maxima. That's when, during the Pleistocene, that was when we had in California, we had the Smilodon, which is the saber-toothed cat. We had woolly mammoths. We had camels in California. We had an incredible amount of mammalian and amphibian creatures that were throughout California as a state. Why is that important? Well, because we started identifying them specifically along the Eastern Sierra, and that was really exciting because it's like, well, we find these things, and then when did they piece into their place? And so they were able to kind of plop them in to see where they go. So they've got all these different, as I said, periods and epochs. I do not often go into the age just because that becomes a little more challenging, but the reason that this exists is because it allows us to talk about genres of time. So if you want to talk about everything within this, we call it tertiary. That's what we're going to consider that entire area. If I wanted to very narrow it down and say that I found a species that only lived within the Pliocene, then I can do that, which is between these zones. So anyway, it's just a different way of looking at it. I hope you enjoyed this. And again, I know it was crash course, pretty lighthearted in that sense, but there's a lot of information that can be had. Again, if this interests you, I highly suggest those two classes, Dinosaurs, and also taking Historical Geology, which has a lab, which is a lot of hands-on fossil stuff. And yeah, yes, it is true. When you take Historical Geology, you too get to play with a piece of coprolite. Thank you, and we'll talk soon.